Ever get that feeling like you're drowning in information? You want to understand something really well, but it feels like there's just mountains of stuff to wade through.
Yeah, definitely.
That's what we're tackling today on the deep dive. We're diving deep into population ecology.
That's right.
So we're figuring out what determines how many of a creature live in a certain place and what makes those numbers go up and down. It's like a crash course in some super fundamental biology that impacts a lot more than you might think. Get ready for those aha moments as we untangle the world of populations.
Exactly. We're giving you a shortcut to understanding this critical part of biology, breaking down the core concepts, looking at how scientists study these things, and highlighting why this knowledge is so important for understanding the world around us.
Sounds like a plan. So first things first, what exactly are we talking about when we say population? In ecology, I mean. It's got to be more specific than just a bunch of the same animals hanging out together.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, for sure. In ecology, a population is a group of individuals of the same species living in the same general area. And because they're all in that same area, they're likely to rely on the same resources, food, water, that sort of thing. They're also exposed to similar environmental conditions,
Okay.
like temperature. And a really important part is that they can potentially interact and breed with each other.
So they're a defined group, shared resources, and the potential to mix their genes.
When we talk about that area they live in, are the boundaries always super clear?
Well, not always. Sometimes the boundaries are pretty obvious, like an island that separates one population of birds from another, or a lake that defines the limits of where a certain fish species can live.
Yeah, makes sense.
But sometimes the boundaries are more for the sake of studying them. So if you're studying deer in a national park, the park boundaries become the boundaries of the deer population you're looking at.
Got it. So that's the where. What about the how many?
Obviously, we talk about population size, the total number of individuals, but there's more to it than just counting heads, right?
Absolutely. Just the total number doesn't tell the whole story. We also look at population density,
Yeah.
which is the number of individuals crammed into a particular area or volume. It's how crowded a population is.
Right.
And then there's dispersion, which describes how those individuals are spaced out within those boundaries.
And I'm guessing that spacing isn't just random. I remember reading about different patterns of dispersion.
Yeah, you're right. The way a population spreads out can tell us a lot about how they interact with each other and their environment.
Okay.
The most common pattern is clumped dispersion, where individuals are kind of clustered together in patches. This happens a lot when resources are concentrated in certain areas. Think of starfish clustered around a rocky shore where there's a ton of food. Or it can be due to social behavior, like a herd of wildebeest grouping up for safety.
Right. Safety in numbers. Makes sense.
Huh.
What about the other patterns?
We also see uniform dispersion. This is where individuals are spaced out evenly. This often comes from direct interactions between individuals, maybe competition for limited resources or defending their territory. Like king penguins, they often space themselves out evenly around their nests because they're fiercely protective of their little nesting areas.
Okay.
And lastly, there's random dispersion. This is where the spacing is unpredictable. There's no real pattern. This tends to happen when individuals aren't really affected by each other and the environment is pretty consistent.
Right.
Like dandelion seeds scattered by the wind, they just land wherever.
So the way they're arranged really reflects what's going on beneath the surface. Now, we also mentioned that population density isn't static, it's always changing.
You got it. Population density is dynamic. It's always in flux due to things that add or remove individuals from the population.
Makes sense.
Births and immigration add individuals to the population. Immigration is when individuals come in from other areas. Deaths and emigration remove individuals. Emigration is when individuals leave an area. Births and deaths are happening constantly. But immigration and emigration can sometimes have a surprisingly big impact on local populations.
Didn't you have a pretty striking example about dolphins?
Oh, yeah. Research on Hector's dolphins in New Zealand found that immigration alone was responsible for something like 15% of their population growth every year. That's a huge chunk just from dolphins moving into the area.
Wow.
And emigration is also important, especially when individuals leave to find new resources or mates. They might even start new populations in other suitable places.
Okay, so we've got these dynamic populations. We know how to define and describe them and how to track those key stats of survival and reproduction.
Right.
Now let's get into how populations actually grow. Earlier, we touched on the idea of exponential growth, sort of the ultimate potential for growth.
Yeah, the exponential growth model describes what happens in a perfect world.
Yeah.
When there are unlimited resources, in this scenario, a population could theoretically keep increasing at a constant rate per individual.
Like that classic example of bacteria doubling every few minutes.
Exactly. If a bacterium can divide every 20 minutes and there are no deaths, that population will explode pretty quickly. This model helps us understand just how much a population could grow when there are no limitations.
Okay, so what's the math behind exponential growth? What's the equation?
Well, we start with the basic idea that the change in population size over time
Okay.
is equal to the number of births minus the number of deaths.
Mm.
For now, we'll ignore immigration and emigration to keep it simple. We can express these birth and death rates on a per capita basis,
Okay.
meaning the number of births or deaths per individual. If little b is the per capita birth rate and little d is the per capita death rate, then the overall per capita rate of increase, which we call R, is just R equals B minus D. This gives us the equation for exponential growth, dn dt equals Rn, where dn dt is the instantaneous rate of change in population size, R is the intrinsic rate of increase, and N is the population size.
So R, the intrinsic rate of increase. That seems like a key figure. It basically tells us how fast a population could grow if everything was perfect.
Yeah, you got it. If you graph population size over time with exponential growth, you get a classic J-shaped curve.
Right.
What's important to remember is that even though the per capita growth rate R stays the same, the actual number of new individuals added to the population gets bigger as the population grows.
Mm.
This happens because the growth rate is determined by both R and the population size N. More individuals means more potential babies even at the same per capita rate.
So are there real-world examples where we actually see this rapid J-shaped growth?
Sometimes. We see it when a species is introduced to a brand new environment, a place with no natural predators or diseases and tons of resources. Like when elephants in Kruger National Park were protected from hunting. Their population grew almost exponentially for something like 60 years.
Hmm.
We also see exponential growth when a population is bouncing back after a major drop, like after a harsh winter or disease outbreak, as long as conditions become favorable again.
Right, so exponential growth shows us the potential, the what if.
Exactly.
But we know in the real world resources aren't unlimited, which leads us to the more realistic logistic growth model.
Right. The logistic growth model recognizes that things like food, water, shelter, and mates are all limited. As a population grows, it eventually bumps into these limits. There's a maximum number of individuals that an environment can sustainably support.
Okay.
This is what we call the carrying capacity, K.
Carrying capacity, it's a pretty fundamental concept,
Yeah,
but I'm guessing it's not a fixed number. It can change.
absolutely. Carrying capacity isn't constant. It can change over time and from place to place. It depends on how available those essential limiting resources are. Things like energy, good shelter, places to hide from predators, important nutrients, water access, and breeding sites. So a certain habitat might have a high carrying capacity for one species that relies on a resource that's plentiful there, but a much lower carrying capacity for a different species that needs something that's scarce in that same area.
Okay, that makes sense.
And environmental changes can also affect carrying capacity, things like seasonal variations or long-term climate change.
So how does carrying capacity fit into our population growth model?
The logistic growth model takes the exponential growth equation and adds a term that accounts for the effect of carrying capacity. As the population size N gets closer to the carrying capacity K, this term slows down the per capita growth rate. The formula for logistic growth is dn dt equals Rn times K minus N divided by K. The term K minus N over K represents how much of the carrying capacity is still available for population growth.
Okay, so when n is small compared to k, that term is close to 1, and the growth is pretty much exponential. But as n gets closer to k, that term gets closer to 0, and growth slows down significantly. And when n actually reaches k, the term becomes 0 and growth stops.
Exactly. And if you graph population size over time under logistic growth, you get a sigmoid or S-shaped curve. At first, the population grows rapidly, kind of like exponential growth.
Okay.
Then at a mid-range population size, the growth starts to slow down as resources become more limited. Finally, as the population gets close to carrying capacity, the growth levels off and the population stabilizes around K. The logistic model shows that the fastest growth happens when the population size is about half of the carrying capacity.
Do any real-world populations actually follow this perfect S-shaped curve.
Well, very few natural populations follow it exactly.
Okay.
But we do see a pretty close match in some lab populations of small organisms, things with simple life cycles and controlled environments, like certain beetle populations, crustaceans, and microorganisms grown in flasks with a limited food supply. But natural populations are much more complex. They deal with environmental changes and interactions with other species, which can make them deviate from that idealized curve.
Right, and we saw an example of that in our research.
Yeah.
Those water flea populations that overshot the carrying capacity.
Oh, yeah, that happens a lot. There's often a lag in how birth and death rates respond to changes in resource availability. For example, even if food becomes scarce, the reproduction rates might not drop right away.
Yeah.
Individuals might still have some stored energy. This delay can cause the population to go over the carrying capacity for a bit, but then when the lack of resources really hits, the population crashes. Sometimes they even drop below the carrying capacity before fluctuating around it again. Some populations also just have these big, unpredictable swings due to environmental factors or complicated relationships with other species. It makes it hard to define a stable carrying capacity in those cases.
So even with these real-world variations, the logistic model is still a useful tool.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Especially in fields like conservation and resource management.
Yep.
It's a good starting point for understanding how populations might grow with limited resources. Scientists use it to estimate things like sustainable harvest rates for things like fish populations, and to figure out the critical population sizes below which endangered species might be at high risk of extinction.
Makes sense.
It's definitely a simplification, but it provides some crucial insights and a foundation for more complex models.
Okay, we've seen how populations grow in both ideal and limited conditions.
Right.
Now let's look at the traits of organisms that affect these patterns and how natural selection shapes those traits.
Yeah.
This brings us to life history traits.
Life history traits are all about the characteristics of an organism's life cycle that directly affect its reproduction and survival. So things like when an organism first reproduces, how often it reproduces during its life, how many offspring it has each time, and how much parental care it provides. These traits aren't just random. They're shaped by evolution. Natural selection favors the life history strategies that help an individual produce the most surviving offspring in their environment.
Because there are always trade-offs, right?
Exactly.
An organism can't be amazing at everything.
Right. Resources like energy and time are limited, so there are always trade-offs between different life functions, like the trade-off between how many offspring an organism has and how much it can invest in each one. Having lots of offspring might increase the overall chances that some will survive.
Okay.
But each one might have a lower chance of survival than an offspring that gets more care and resources. There can also be trade-offs between investing in reproducing now and being able to survive and reproduce in the future.
And these trade-offs lead to the huge diversity of life history strategies we see in nature.
Yeah.
Our research highlighted some pretty stark contrasts.
Oh, for sure. Think about the difference in when organisms first start reproducing. A loggerhead sea turtle might not reach sexual maturity and start laying eggs until it's like 30 years old.
Wow.
While a coho salmon typically reproduces for the first time at just 3 or 4 years old.
Big difference.
Then you've got how often reproduction happens. Coho salmon are simiparous, meaning they reproduce once in a big event and then die. Agaves are another example. They grow for years, store up resources, flower once in a spectacular display, produce a ton of seeds, and then the parent plant dies. It's like big bang reproduction.
One massive effort, and then that's it.
Yeah, exactly. Then there's iteroparity.
Okay.
This is repeated reproduction throughout an organism's life. Loggerhead turtles, after they reach maturity, will reproduce multiple times over their long lives.
Wow.
Just like most mammals and birds and many long-lived plants like oak trees. And of course, there's the huge variation in the number of offspring produced each time. A white rhino usually gives birth to a single calf after a long pregnancy, while many insects and plants can have hundreds or even thousands of offspring at once.
So natural selection favors the set of traits that lets individuals have the most surviving offspring in their specific environment.
Exactly. That harsh, unpredictable environment where an agave lives might favor that single, massive reproductive effort to maximize the chances that at least some offspring will find the right conditions to grow. In contrast, the more stable, longer lifespans of loggerhead turtles in the ocean might favor repeated reproduction, letting them take advantage of good conditions in multiple years and spread out their reproductive effort over time. Even within the same species, environmental conditions can influence these trade-offs. Like studies on Eurasian kestrels found that parent birds that put more effort into raising larger broods in one year had a lower survival rate and were less likely to reproduce the next year, showing that there's a direct cost to reproducing now on their ability to survive later.
It's all about balancing the energy budget.
Right.
Our research also mentioned the trade-off between the size and number of offspring.
Oh, yeah. Organisms often have to choose between having many small offspring or a few large ones. In environments where it's really tough for offspring to survive and there's no parental care, producing lots of small offspring can be a good strategy.
Hmm.
It increases the chances that at least a few will make it. Like dandelions, they have tons of tiny wind-dispersed seeds. On the other hand, if being bigger or having more parental care significantly increases an offspring's chance of survival, then having fewer larger offspring that are well supplied with resources is the way to go.
Makes sense.
Like the big nutrient-rich seeds of a Brazil nut.
And these different pressures often lead us to classify life history strategies along a spectrum, with K selection and R selection at either end.
Exactly. These terms describe the different forces that shape life history traits.
Okay.
K selection happens in populations that live at or near their carrying capacity, K. Where there's a lot of competition for limited resources, organisms that thrive under K selection usually have traits like fewer offspring, lots of parental care, longer lifespans, and often a larger size.
Yep.
These are the traits that make them competitive in crowded environments. Think of mature trees in a forest or large mammals that live a long time.
And R selection is essentially the opposite.
Pretty much. R selection favors traits that maximize the intrinsic rate of increase R. In environments where population densities are low and there's not much competition for resources, this is common in places that are disturbed or newly colonized. Organisms favored by R selection usually reproduce early, have a ton of offspring with little or no parental care, live shorter lives, and are smaller in size.
Okay.
Their strategy is to exploit good conditions quickly and pump out as many offspring as possible. Weeds that colonize a cleared field are a classic example. It's important to remember that K selection and R selection are two ends of a spectrum. Many species fall somewhere in between.
Got it. So we've seen how life history traits evolve.
Hmm.
Now let's dig deeper into what keeps populations from just growing exponentially forever. We've talked about carrying capacity.
Right.
But what are the specific factors that come into play? I'm talking about density-dependent and density-independent factors.
Yeah, populations in the real world don't just grow without limits. There are things that regulate their growth.
Okay.
Some of these are density-independent factors. These affect birth and death rates no matter how dense the population is.
Okay.
They're often things like extreme weather, like severe frosts, droughts, or heat waves.
Right.
These can kill a lot of individuals in a population, regardless of how crowded it is. Natural disasters like volcanic eruptions or wildfires also fall into this category.
So a sudden frost doesn't care how many insects are in a field. It affects them all.
Exactly. But then you have density-dependent factors. These are the ones where the impact on birth or death rates changes depending on how dense the population is. So, for example, the death rate might increase as the population gets more crowded, or the birth rate might decline. These are the factors that can really regulate population growth, making a population shrink when it gets too big and grow when it's small.
Okay.
This helps keep the population size stable around the carrying capacity.
And what are some of the key density-dependent mechanisms?
There are several important ones. Competition for resources is a big one. As population density increases, individuals have to compete more for essential resources like food, water, shelter, light for plants, and nutrients. This can lead to fewer offspring being born, lower survival rates, and even more individuals leaving the area.
Okay.
Another density-dependent factor is territoriality. When space gets limited, individuals that can establish and defend a territory can prevent others from getting resources there, effectively limiting how dense the population can get in a given area, like cheetahs maintaining territories.
Right, so only the individuals that can get a territory might get to reproduce,
Yeah.
limiting the overall growth. What other density-dependent factors are there?
Disease. The spread of disease can be strongly influenced by density. In crowded populations, diseases can transmit much more easily, leading to more sickness and deaths. Think about how quickly the flu can spread in a densely populated city, or how a fungus can wipe out a dense patch of plants. Predation can also be density dependent. In some cases, predators can hunt more effectively when there are more prey around.
Okay.
leading to a higher death rate per capita for the prey, like those kelp perch that had higher death rates at higher densities because there weren't enough hiding places from predators.
So a larger prey population might seem good at first, but it can attract more predators or make it easier for them to hunt.
Exactly.
What else can regulate populations in a density-dependent way?
The buildup of toxic waste can be a factor, especially for microorganisms in closed environments. Like yeast cells, they produce ethanol as a byproduct of fermentation. But high levels of ethanol can poison the yeast themselves, slowing down their growth and eventually causing the population to decline.
Hmm.
And finally, there are things within an organism's own physiology that can act in a density-dependent way. In some species, high population densities can trigger stress responses, hormonal changes, and reduced reproduction,
Okay.
even if there's still enough food and shelter. Studies on white-footed mice have shown that reproductive rates drop in high-density populations because of these internal factors.
It's amazing how all these different mechanisms work together to keep populations from exploding.
Mm.
But even with these regulatory factors, we still see fluctuations in population sizes,
Yeah.
sometimes pretty drastic ones.
Yeah.
That's where population dynamics comes in, right?
Right. Population dynamics looks at the complex interactions between living and non-living factors that cause these variations in population sizes. Some populations stay relatively stable over long periods, fluctuating only within a narrow range.
Okay.
But many populations have huge, sometimes cyclical swings in their numbers from year to year or even season to season. A classic example is the moose and wolf populations on Isle Royale in Lake Superior. Their numbers have gone up and down significantly over decades. Influenced by things like harsh winters affecting moose survival, how many moose are available for the wolves to eat, and even diseases affecting both species.
And then there are those more predictable cycles, like the famous example of snowshoe hares and lynx.
Oh yeah, those 10-year cycles in snowshoe hares and their main predator, the Canadian lynx, have been studied for decades. The prevailing idea now is that it's a combination of predator-prey interactions and the hare's food supply that drives these cycles.
Right.
Changes in the availability of the hare's winter food, which is mostly willow and birch, can affect their population.
Makes sense.
But experiments where scientists gave hares extra food didn't stop those cyclical declines. However, research that tracked what was killing the hares has shown that being eaten by lynx is a major cause of death, especially when the hare population is declining. This points to a feedback loop where more hares lead to more lynx, which leads to fewer hares, which then leads to fewer lynx, and the cycle starts over.
So it's this back and forth between predator and prey.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And when we think about population dynamics on a larger scale, we have to consider the role of immigration and emigration, especially when talking about metapopulation.
Metapopulations, that's where you have multiple separate populations of the same species connected by individuals moving between them. Right?
Yeah, that's it. Imagine a species living in a landscape where suitable habitat is broken up into patches separated by areas that aren't suitable.
Yeah.
Each patch can support a local population, and these populations are linked by individuals moving from one to another. This network of local populations is a metapopulation. Even if a local population dies out in one patch, maybe because of a disturbance or a change in the environment, that patch can potentially be recolonized by immigrants from other populations within the metapopulation.
So it's a constant process of local extinctions and recolonizations that lets the species survive across the whole landscape.
Exactly. The Glanville fritillary butterfly on the Åland Islands of Finland is a great example. These butterflies live in tons of small isolated meadows, but the specific meadows they occupy change over time. Local populations go extinct in some meadows, and new ones are established in others through dispersal. The butterfly's ability to move between these patches is crucial for the whole metapopulation to survive. Even genetic factors like specific gene variants that affect flight ability can influence whether an individual disperses and therefore how the whole metapopulation works.
Okay, so we've covered a lot about general population ecology.
We have.
Now let's focus on a particular population that has a huge impact: humans. Human population growth over the last few centuries has been pretty remarkable, to say the least.
Oh yeah. Unprecedented is a good word for it. The human population has grown at an incredible rate. It took about 200 years for the global population to double from 500 million to 1 billion.
Okay.
But then it only took about 130 years to double to 2 billion and a mere 45 years to double again to 4 billion. This shows just how much the rate of growth has been accelerating. We're now over 7.6 billion people globally and adding about 80 million people every year.
That's a huge number.
Yeah,
But I understand that the rate of growth has actually slowed down a bit in recent decades.
that's right. The global population growth rate peaked in the late 1960s at about 2% and has dropped to around 1.1% since then. Projections suggest it'll continue to gradually decline in the coming decades. But even with a slower growth rate, the sheer size of the population means we're still adding a lot of people every year. This slowing down is due to several things,
Okay.
including the impact of diseases like AIDS in some areas and people choosing to have smaller families and population control measures in other parts of the world.
And population growth isn't the same everywhere in the world, right?
Yeah. Oh, no, not at all. We see really different trends in different regions. Some industrialized countries have fairly stable populations where birth rates and death rates are about equal. Then there's the demographic transition.
Hmm.
This is the historical shift from high birth and death rates to low birth and death rates that often happens alongside things like economic development, industrialization, better living standards, healthcare, and education. Countries like Sweden went through this over a period of more than 150 years. In other places like Mexico, the transition happened more quickly, but it's still ongoing. Things like access to healthcare, sanitation, good nutrition, and especially education and economic opportunities for women really affect birth and death rates and how fast the demographic transition happens.
And our sources also mention the big impact of specific government policies like China's one-child policy.
Oh, yeah. That policy, which was in place for several decades, had a huge effect on China's birth rates and population growth. In many industrialized countries, as we mentioned, the average number of children per woman has fallen to or even below the replacement level. This means their populations would eventually start to shrink without significant immigration or an increase in birth rates. In fact, some countries, especially in Eastern and Central Europe, are already seeing their populations decline. Right now, most global population growth is happening in less industrialized countries. They now make up the largest portion of the world's population.
Another key factor in understanding human population dynamics is age structure,
Right.
often shown in those population pyramids.
Well, yeah, those age structure diagrams or population pyramids. They visually show how individuals are distributed across different age groups within a population, usually separated by sex. The shape of the pyramid can tell us a lot about a population's potential for growth and its future demographic trends. A pyramid with a wide base, meaning there are a lot of young people, like we see in many less industrialized countries like Zambia, suggests there could be rapid population growth in the future as these young people reach reproductive age. A more rectangular pyramid like that of the United States suggests a more even distribution of age groups and points to slower or more stable growth. And a pyramid with a narrow base and a wider top, like in Italy, means there are more older people and fewer young people. This suggests a declining population because there aren't enough young people to replace the aging generations. These different age structures have big implications for things like the size of the future workforce, the demand for healthcare, and the sustainability of things like Social Security and pension systems.
And then there are the huge differences we see globally in infant mortality rates and life expectancy.
Yeah, these are really powerful indicators of the overall quality of life and how developed a country is. The big differences we see, for example, the much higher infant mortality rate and lower average life expectancy in a country like Angola compared to a country like Japan, show the huge disparities in access to healthcare, nutrition, sanitation, clean water, and just overall living conditions.
Okay.
These fundamental factors also influence decisions about family size. Parents in regions with high infant mortality rates might have more children to ensure that at least some survive to adulthood.
Go ahead.
While in countries with low infant mortality and higher life expectancy, people tend to have smaller families.
So when we talk about the Earth's carrying capacity for humans, things get pretty complicated.
Yeah,
It's
exactly.
not just about space and food. There are so many factors at play.
Right. There have been attempts to estimate the carrying capacity of Earth for humans going all the way back to the 1600s. Some early estimates were surprisingly accurate, but later attempts have produced a wide range of figures. It's incredibly difficult to get a precise estimate. Different approaches use different methods, like trying to fit human population growth to logistic curves, using data from other species to make generalizations about population density, or focusing on specific limiting factors like food production. The ecological footprint concept offers a different way to look at human impact. It measures the total amount of land and water area needed to produce the resources we consume and absorb the waste we generate. It's usually measured in global hectares or GA.
Yeah.
Studies have shown that the average ecological footprint per person is larger than what's considered sustainable, meaning we're using resources faster than the planet can replenish them.
Hmm.
For example, the U.S. has a particularly large footprint, emphasizing the unsustainable levels of consumption in many developed countries.
So ultimately, the Earth's carrying capacity for humans depends on a lot of things,
Oh, yeah, definitely.
including our choices about how we use resources and manage our population.
Exactly. Our technological advancements have undoubtedly increased the Earth's carrying capacity in many ways. But we can't keep pushing those limits indefinitely. There are still fundamental constraints, like the amount of arable land available for agriculture, access to fresh water, and the planet's capacity to absorb our waste. The choices we make as a global society about things like consumption patterns, resource management, and population growth will ultimately determine the trajectory of the human population and our impact on the planet.
It's a sobering thought, but also a reminder that we have some agency in shaping our future.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, this has been an incredible journey through the world of population ecology. We've seen how populations grow, what regulates their size, and the fascinating life history strategies that organisms have evolved.
We've also seen how human population growth has exploded in recent centuries and the challenges and choices we face as our numbers continue to rise.
From the intricate dynamics of predator-prey cycles to the complexities of human impact on the planet.
Right.
It's a reminder that everything is connected, and the decisions we make today have consequences for the future of all life on Earth. Food for thought as we wrap up this deep dive. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. It's been great.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep into the fascinating world around us.
Absolutely.
We'll see you on the next Deep Dive.
See you then.